WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. Michigan workers have been fighting for better pay and better benefits. That brings us to court-ordered minimum wage and sick leave laws. They were set to take effect Friday, but state lawmakers struck a deal changing the laws again. The minimum wage did raise and is expected to reach $15 an hour in 2027, and tips earned by some wage workers will stay intact under this court order, which would have phased out over time. There were also changes to paid sick leave laws.
The result is a win for the workers and businesses who argue that eliminating the tipped wage would hurt businesses and discourage tipping. To hear how supporters of the court-ordered laws are feeling, we're joined by Saru Jayaraman. She's the president of One Fair Wage, an organization advocating for a $15 minimum wage for workers nationally. Saru, welcome to the Metro.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Saru, as briefly as you can, what do these new laws do?
So let's start with the fact that the court-ordered decision that raises the wage to $15 for all workers in Michigan, 1.2 million workers with tips on top, that was set to go into effect and, in fact, did go into effect for a couple of hours on Friday morning before the new laws were signed by the governor, would have raised wages for all workers in Michigan and kept tips intact, as Minnesota and many other states have already done. The laws that were passed and signed on Friday afternoon reduced workers' wages, particularly tipped and restaurant workers' wages, 50%, back down to $7.50, and also actually froze their wages entirely so that tipped workers, per these new laws, wouldn't get any raise this year if we don't take action. So it's a huge punch in the gut to restaurant workers and tipped workers who've been leading the fight to raise wages for all workers for 10 years, actually 11 years, since 2014. We've been the ones initiating the whole thing, driving the whole thing for these workers in particular who have been leading the thing to be cut out of the minimum wage almost entirely. That's not a win. That is a punch in the face by the same politicians who promised for many years that they would never do what the Republicans did to us in 2018.
Saru, Governor Whitmer signed this bill into law after the court-ordered changes had gone into effect. How did you feel? What was your initial reaction? I mean, it sounds like you were quite frustrated.
Workers feel incredibly betrayed. I mean, in 2018, when the Republicans, did this incredibly unconstitutional thing of adopting our initiative, telling the press, we don't want this to go to the ballot because it will drive the quote-unquote wrong people out to vote. Who are those wrong people? Low-wage workers, people of color, women of color, single moms who are paid right now $4 an hour per Michigan's sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, a direct legacy of slavery. In 2018, when those politicians, those Republicans adopted our initiative, made it the law because they didn't want it to go to the ballot because it would drive the wrong people to vote. These same politicians who changed the law just now said, that's a travesty. That is a violation of the Michigan Constitution. And we mobilized 100,000 workers to turn out to vote that year for people who said, we stand for the Constitution. Governor Whitmer, Senate Majority Leader Winnie Brinks, people who said, we stand with the Constitution, the Republicans do not. So for those same people to come back in 2025, after the Supreme Court declared what the Republicans did unconstitutional, and do the exact same thing, amend this bill that voters have called for, 1 million voters have signed petitions for, in the same way that the Republicans did, was just a complete stab in the back and a betrayal to workers who helped them get elected. And so we are now initiating a referendum to ensure that voters, not politicians, get to determine that all workers in Michigan deserve a raise.
Saru, I'm going to ask you to speculate here for a moment. Why do you think things happened this way? You said this felt like a gut punch. You were surprised. Why do you feel that this is how things transpired?
I do want to say the majority of Democrats in both the House and the Senate voted against this proposal, voted for the people, democracy, and the Constitution holding sway. I think a minority of Democrats made a deal with Republicans a backdoor deal that involved some kind of give on other issues, and in the end sacrificed 400,000 tipped workers who are overwhelmingly women, disproportionately women of color. As I said, it's the occupation with the highest rates of both single mothers and sexual harassment of any industry. It's the lowest wage workforce of women in the state. They basically sacrificed these women, threw them under the bus in exchange for a deal we're not even clear about what they achieved.
Now, the tipped wage will remain intact under this new law, and it will not be phased out. Many of your opponents argue this is a win for businesses that wouldn't be able to afford a $15 minimum wage. What's your response to that?
There are actually hundreds of Michigan restaurants that already pay a full minimum wage with tips on top, and many that did that after the pandemic because so many workers left this industry saying, you know what, I just can't live on $3 and $4 anymore, and the instability of tips and the vulnerability that tips created during the pandemic and, frankly, at all times. Your tips go up and down day to day, week to week, month to month. Your bills remain the same. It's impossible to live, particularly with the incredible rise in the cost of living post-pandemic. So a lot of workers left. A lot of employers raised wages voluntarily. They're going really strong. Many of them spoke out about this issue and say, I pay a full minimum wage with tips on top. It works. And frankly, there are thousands of employers that do this in other states. Minnesota, not too far from Michigan, but also Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Montana, Alaska, California, Chicago, Washington, D.C. all require a full minimum wage with tips on top. And actually, small businesses and small business restaurants are growing faster in those states. And tipping is the same or higher in those states as it is in Michigan. So what this is fear-mongering by a national corporate trade lobby called the National Restaurant Association. We call it the other NRA. They've been around since 1919, over 100 years, since Jim Crow, arguing that they shouldn't have to pay their own workers because we, the customers, should pay their workers' wages for them. It's a direct legacy of slavery created after emancipation to allow restaurants to hire newly freed Black workers for free, not pay them, and force them to live on tips. It has persisted all these years, which is precisely why workers have been fighting in Michigan for 10 years to get rid of it and to do what Minnesota has done for decades.
Saru, forgive me for jumping in, but there are a lot of workers, waiters, and bartenders in Michigan who get a tipped wage who didn't want to have their tips replaced with a raise in minimum wage. Democratic lawmakers said they were responding to those people. What do you make of those workers' perspectives?
So first of all, the sentence you just said is incorrect. So the idea that this is a minimum wage that would replace tips is a falsehood that was promoted by the Restaurant Association. This policy would raise the minimum wage to a full minimum wage with tips intact on top of that wage as exists in Minnesota and Montana and Alaska and all of these other states that have robust tipping on top of a wage. In 2017, the National Restaurant Association created a fake grassroots PAC called Save Our Tips in Maine. And in every state where workers have tried to raise wages, including in Michigan, where 70% of tipped workers said they wanted a raise to a full minimum wage with tips on top, they have brought this fake PAC. They have held captive audience meetings with workers. They have told them this wage is going to make your tips go away, which is a complete lie. And then they have paid these workers. We found Reddit threads with workers saying, I'm being offered $150 to go to Lansing and say I don't want my tips to go away. The overwhelming majority of tipped workers in Michigan know that they need and they want a full minimum wage with tips on top. There are some workers who've been lied to in captive audience meetings and told this is going to replace your tips with wages, which is not what this is. And that is the same campaign they have run in every single state where workers have been fighting to raise wages. Now, there are many Democrats who received those calls and understood that they were being lied to, that they were being called by workers who were being lied to. There were a minority of Democrats who said, oh, I have to listen to workers who are being called at the compulsion of their employer.
Saru, we're getting a little short on time here, and there are a few other questions that we want to ask you. I'm going to pass things along on the mic to Tia Graham here for that.
Yes, indeed. I actually had to turn the mic on really quickly. But excuse me, Saru, I just want to talk to you a little bit about the minimum wage that will raise to $15 an hour in 2027. That's faster than it would have gone up under the court order. So do you see this as a win? Even though we've been talking, you don't see much of a win here at all. So can you talk about any positives that you're seeing coming out of this?
No, there's no positive. This was a trick by politicians to undermine the will of the voters, which is to raise the minimum wage for all workers to $15 an hour with tips on top. And because it was a complete loss for workers, we are initiating a referendum that's already gaining a ton of support that will stop this bad bill in its tracks this year so that all workers get a raise this year as ordered by the Michigan Supreme Court. And
we are definitely going to get down to that because I would love to hear a little bit more. We would all love to hear a little bit more about the steps and processes that you all are going to take to do that. But Saru, let's talk about sick leave. It's not what the court ordered, but the legislation expands sick leave to small businesses and increases the number of hours for employees of large businesses. Is that enough? Why not?
The original law that, again, voters, hundreds of thousands of voters signed petitions to put on the ballot would have allowed workers the right to what's called a private right of action, to actually go to court or sue or file a charge if they are not getting their paid sick leave right as required. The new law takes that right away so that if a worker doesn't feel like they, are getting the paid sick leave or knows that they're not getting the paid sick leave that they are required to get by law, they have much fewer recourses, much fewer avenues to seek recourse, to seek the actual paid sick leave benefits that they are allowed by law. So that is one of the biggest losses of this bill. I mean, across the board, this was a give to corporations and business. This was a deal struck with Republicans and corporations and business to essentially diminish the rights that workers sought and that voters, millions of voters, signed petitions to get.
And what are fair wages' next steps? You talked a little bit about fighting for those wages for workers towards the end of this year. So what are your next steps?
So, we have collected over 500,000 signatures 3 times in Michigan. We did it in 2014, we did it in 2018, we did it in 2022. For a referendum, which is a little different than initiative, you actually only need half the signatures that would be required for a ballot initiative. So we have absolutely no doubt that we will be able to collect the 223,000 required signatures, valid signatures, 330,000 raw, in a matter of months to be able to freeze the law that was just put into place and ensure that the Supreme Court order does go into effect this year.
And before we let you go, I just been hearing a lot about everything that's happening right now. You've been talking about how unhappy you are, frankly angry about the laws that have gone through. So could you just talk a little bit about, everything that we're seeing right now in the world, everything we're seeing with our government, and what ways do you see what's happening federally impacting us here in Michigan and with the work you do?
I'm so glad you asked, because the very workers that these politicians are stripping rights away from are the ones that are most under attack by the Trump administration. The restaurant industry is the largest employer of immigrants. These are the biggest users of food stamps and Medicaid that's being cut. Restaurant workers, tipped workers use food stamps at double the rate of other workers. They're losing their food stamps. The Trump administration already announced that they're working with the National Restaurant Association. The very same people who struck this deal just now in Michigan are working with Trump to roll back protections for tipped workers so that they don't have rights to sue if they're not being paid properly, if their tips don't bring them to the full minimum wage. All of their rights are being taken away at the federal level. So for Michigan legislators to basically side with the Trump administration to take more rights away from the lowest paid women, from the lowest wage workers in Michigan, is a travesty. It's a devastation, particularly because these are the workers that have been leading the fight to raise wages for all workers for the last decade. So we are excited that voters are outraged and standing up for these workers, already, signing up to volunteer, to collect petitions. We know we'll be able to restore these rights by this year. And we know that Michigan workers can and will stand up to all of the onslaught that's coming both from the Trump administration and from politicians in Michigan that are siding with him.
Saru Jayaraman is the president of One Fair Wage, an organization advocating for a $15 minimum wage for workers nationally. Saru, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you.
From the WDET newsroom, Detroit is hosting a performing arts summit with arts leaders to discuss how to invest in the arts in the city. The summit is this Saturday at 10 a.m. at the Detroit School of Arts. Coming up at 11, the Trump administration has been cutting federal jobs and freezing federal funding. What should we make of these decisions thus far? Is it conservative politics as usual, or is it something more threatening to democracy? In the next hour, we'll speak with a Michigan Republican leader, an expert on Ronald Reagan, and a political scientist. Up next, science makes the mundane exceptional. We'll see how the Michigan Science Center is working to do that with kids and adults alike. This is the Metro on WDET. Stay with us.